Tonight, close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing on a stone quay under a warm evening sky 3,000 years ago. The air smells of cedar and salt. Somewhere behind you, a lamp is being lit. Voices drift down from the palace high on the hill, traders, scribes, someone laughing. Ships from every corner of a connected world creak softly at anchor, their ropes sighing against the dock. Egyptian grain sits in sealed amphorae stacked 3 high. Cypriot copper gleams in the low golden light. Tin has come from mountains no one standing here has ever seen. And down the quay, a merchant from the coast of what we would one day call Lebanon is counting bolts of purple-dyed cloth with the careful attention of someone who understands exactly what they are worth. This is one of the most cosmopolitan cities on Earth. Its name is Ugarit. In 80 years, no one will remember it. We're often told that human history moves forward, that each generation stands a little taller on the shoulders of the last, that whatever was built stays built, that whatever was learned stays learned, that the arc of civilization bends always toward more, toward better, toward permanent. Except, that's almost completely wrong. Across the deep past of our species, not in myth, not in legend, but in actual dirt and clay and stone that people have dug up and held in their hands, there are gaps. Long, quiet gaps. Whole civilizations that flourished for centuries and then grew still. Not in a single dramatic ending, but slowly, like a lamp that dims as the oil runs low, until one morning there is no longer a flame. And here's the thing about those gaps, they are not empty, they are full. Full of cities that we are still mapping, full of languages that a million hands wrote into tablets and stone that no living person today can read. Full of temples older than anything we usually call ancient, built by people whose names we don't know, for reasons we have not yet understood. A script thousands of small stamped signs pressed into clay across an entire subcontinent that represents one of the most widespread writing systems in human history. And not one scholar alive today has read a single word of it. That silence tells you something important. Not about the people who wrote it, but about us. About how much we've forgotten that we forgot. Once you start to see these gaps, you see them everywhere. Tonight, I want to take you through 5 of them. Slowly, without any particular hurry, we'll walk through the last days of a world so connected it might remind you of your own. We'll stand in a city that moved water through channels under every street, 1,500 years before Rome. We'll wander through the largest city in North America, a place most history books have never mentioned. We'll find walls of stone so precisely fitted they're still standing, from a civilization that history tried hard to forget. And we'll end at the oldest place I know of, a site so far back in time that when its builders were alive, the Sahara was green. 5 ages. 5 silences, all of them still speaking. The roads you drive on trace routes carved by civilizations that are gone. The crops in your kitchen were cultivated by farmers whose names we'll never know. The feeling of quiet awe when you look at a vast open sky. That feeling was felt by someone standing in the same darkness you're in right now, 10,000 years ago, with the same wide open eyes. Because here's the thing, and this is the thought I want to carry with you through everything that comes tonight. What humanity forgot is still, quietly, shaping the world you're lying in right now. These aren't just stories about the past. They're the hidden architecture of the present. So, let's begin. But first, before I take you anywhere, I want to take a moment, as we always do here, to say hello, because wherever you are tonight, you're not alone in this. If you're watching this to fall asleep tonight, if that's exactly why you came here, then that's exactly why I make these videos. There's nothing to stay awake for. There's no test at the end. You're allowed to drift. You're allowed to let parts of this wash over you like water without holding on to any of it. That is not just acceptable. That is genuinely the point. So if you haven't already, get comfortable. Pull the blanket up if you have one. Let the screen go dark if you can. You don't need to see anything tonight. Just listen. And if you find yourself here in the hours when most of the world is quiet, we should say hello. Because you are not alone in this. Right now, someone in San Francisco is settling in at 11 at night, windows fogged against the bay. In London, it's past 3 in the morning and someone is still awake, wondering. In Sydney, the sun is almost up, but sleep still hasn't come. In Mumbai, someone has been lying in the dark since 2. In Toronto, in Lagos, in Auckland, in Osaka, the same soft lamp, the same searching stillness. This channel has been keeping company with people in those hours for a long time, and I'm glad you're here. These check-ins, and there are hundreds of them in the comments below, these videos are one of the things that make doing this worthwhile, because it turns out there are a lot of people who find the hours between 2 and 5 in the morning very long and very quiet. And sometimes a story about people who lived 10,000 years ago is exactly the right company. If what we do here, history told slowly, as a story rather than a lecture, in the hours when it's quiet is something you want to return to, I'd love it if you hit subscribe. And if you want to leave a note before you close your eyes, just tell me where you are and what time it is. Those little messages, 4 am, Sacramento, 3:30 in Edinburgh. Just arrived in Nairobi, they're one of the best parts of this. Now. Tonight we visit 5 ages. First, we go back to that stone quay and we watch a world that had been running smoothly for centuries begin to come undone. A world of copper and tin and grain and diplomacy spread across the eastern Mediterranean, brought down not by a single catastrophe, but by the fragility of everything it had built. We'll spend the first part of tonight in the late Bronze Age. Then we cross to the Indus River, to a city at Mohenjo-daro that, at its height, was one of the largest urban centres on Earth, with streets laid to a grid, water channels running beneath every house, and a writing system that not one person alive today has ever read. After that, we travel west, across the Atlantic, to the banks of the Mississippi, where a city stood larger than London was at the time it was abandoned that most of the world has never heard of. Then south, to a hillside in Zimbabwe, where walls of granite were fitted with such precision and such mystery that when outsiders first found them, they refused to believe the people who lived nearby could have built them. And finally, we go all the way back, to a hilltop in the mountains of southeastern Turkey, 12,000 years ago, where people who had not yet learned to farm were already building temples, where someone first looked up at the night sky and decided it deserved a monument. 5 worlds, all of them forgotten, all of them still here. So get comfortable, really comfortable. Close your eyes if you want to. Let the story carry you. Here we go. We're going back to Ugarit, and this time, we're going to stay a while. Stand here with me for a moment. The year is approximately 1200 BC, not before Christ in the religious sense, simply before the world we recognize, before classical Greece, before the Roman Republic, before the Hebrew kingdoms, the Persian Empire, the founding of Carthage. All of that is still ahead. All of that is in the future of the people standing on this quay tonight. What exists now is something else, something that most people, if you described it to them, would find hard to believe is that old. The Mediterranean world of the late Bronze Age is, by 1200 BC, a trading network of extraordinary reach and sophistication, not a collection of isolated villages trading grain with their nearest neighbours. A system that moves copper from the mines of Cyprus to the warehouses of the Nile Delta. That brings tin, which you need to make bronze, which you need to make everything from ship fittings to axe heads to the latches on palace doors from somewhere far to the north and east, possibly Afghanistan, possibly Central Europe, possibly as far as Britain, though no one in Ugarit has ever been there, or would know the name. A system that sends textiles from Egypt to Canaan to Anatolia and back, that trades lapis lazuli, a vivid, impossible blue stone across 2,000 miles from mines in northeastern Afghanistan to the courts of Pharaoh. In other words, a world that looks, in its basic logic, quite a lot like ours. So let's stand in it. The city of Ugarit sits on the coast of what is today Syria, at a site archaeologists now call Ras Shamra, the Fennel Headland. It's high season, late afternoon, the sun is low, and the harbour smells the way Mediterranean harbours still smell in summer. Of pitch and cedar, of salt, and something burning beyond the warehouse's charcoal, or oil somewhere you can't quite see. The air sits warm in your lungs when you breathe it. Not uncomfortable, just present, the way warmth is when you're somewhere that has held the sun all day. The harbour is busy. Ships from at least half a dozen different cultures are tied at the dock. A wide, flat-bottomed vessel from the Nile has just unloaded. Porters are moving amphorae sealed against the voyage, heavy with grain up the stone ramp that leads to the city's warehouse district. Two men are arguing in a language you don't recognize. A scribe with a clay tablet is watching them without expression, waiting for the dispute to resolve itself before he records the outcome. From the hill above comes the sound of the palace. Not dramatic sound, not drums, not proclamations, just the ordinary sound of a large building full of people. Voices, footsteps, the distant clatter of something being set down on stone. And at the far end of the quay, someone is making a fire. Just a small cook fire in a clay brazier, sheltered against the evening wind coming off the water. The smoke rises in a thin, clean line. The fire is the warmest thing in view. Here's the thing about Ugarit. It isn't particularly large. At its height, it held somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 people. By our standards, that's a modest town. But in 1200 BC, Ugarit is not what we mean by a town. It is an international hub. The streets of the city are laid out with deliberate intention, not as precisely as what you'll see later tonight in the Indus, but recognizably planned. The houses in the residential quarters have courtyards. Some have second stories. Most have small altars set into niches in the walls, not grand religious monuments, but the household kind, the kind that says, "We live here," and we leave a small space for what we cannot control. The city has craft workshops where metal workers and potters and weavers have worked for generations. It has a scribal school, a building where students practice writing by copying out texts, making mistakes, being corrected, learning the trade. The palace itself has 90 rooms. 90. There is a royal residence, an administrative quarter, workshops, storerooms, and an archive. And the archive is what matters most to us now, because it survived. When the city was destroyed, the fire that burned it also hardened the clay tablets in the archive, the way a potter's kiln hardens clay. And so we have it. We have the correspondence of a Bronze Age cosmopolitan city, preserved by the same catastrophe that ended it. The archive at Ugarit contains documents in 8 different languages. 8. In one city's record-keeping system, Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the age, as close to a universal language as anything that existed before the modern era. Ugaritic, a local Semitic language. Sumerian, already ancient even then. Hurrian, Egyptian. Cypro-Minoan script, and glossaries vocabulary lists for scribes learning a second language, the Bronze Age equivalent of a phrase book. In the royal correspondence, in the diplomatic letters exchanged between Ugarit and the other great powers, you find a picture of extraordinary sophistication. The king of Ugarit addresses the pharaoh as his lord, his son, his father. He sends gifts. He receives gifts. There are standing protocols about how a lesser king addresses a greater, about what happens when a merchant ship from one kingdom wrecks in the waters of another, about trade terms and the treatment of foreigners. A merchant writes to complain that he has been waiting in a foreign harbour for 3 weeks and no one has settled his account. A trade dispute is brought before a Hittite court, with witnesses named, depositions recorded, a judgment rendered and preserved on clay. This is not primitive. This is not the isolated world of wandering tribes that we might imagine when we hear 1200 BC. This is a world of contracts and legal mechanisms and diplomatic norms. A world that had figured out, over centuries of trial and error, how to manage the extraordinary complexity of large-scale trade across long distances and between cultures with very different languages and ways of organizing themselves. And then, among the last tablets recovered from Ugarit found still in the Scribe's quarter, never sent there is a handful of letters that read differently from the rest. The king of Ugarit writes to the king of Alashia, Cyprus. Ships have been sighted, he writes. Strange ships, belonging to no kingdom that the scribes could name, moving along the coast. Cities are burning. His army and his fleet are elsewhere, sent away before the threat materialized, to defend another border. The city is exposed. He needs grain. He needs soldiers. He needs ships. The letter was never sent. It was found in the ash. At some point between the writing of that letter and the sealing of it, Ugarit ended. Not through gradual abandonment. In fire. The destruction layer is sharp. Above it, silence. No rebuilding. No later settlement on the same spot. Whatever the people of Ugarit were doing in their last days, writing letters, making offerings, watching the horizon, it was not enough. And the ships they were watching for, the ships that no scribe in the archive could name those ships, are one of the great unresolved questions of ancient history. We will come back to them. But for now, hold this image. The warm harbour, the cedar smell, the fire in the clay brazier at the end of the dock, its smoke rising clean and straight into the evening air, the scribe pressing his stylus into wet clay, writing words that no one on the other end would ever read. Because this was not just one city. What happened to Ugarit happened within a few decades on either side of 1200 BC to almost every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean. And that raises the question that has occupied historians for 100 years. Why? Why did the whole network, a network that had survived for centuries, go quiet within a single generation? So let's talk about why it broke. Not how one city burned, but why the entire network, a network that had been absorbing on a scry of socks and recovering from disruptions for centuries, failed within a few decades, almost everywhere at once. Here's the thing. When we imagine ancient civilizations collapsing, we tend to reach for simple explanations. An invasion, a conquering army sweeping through with fire and superior weapons. One cause, one effect. A story with a clear villain. The late Bronze Age collapse doesn't have a villain. Or rather, it has so many contributing factors that no single one of them is sufficient to explain what happened. What it has instead is something more interesting and, when you sit with it, more unsettling. It has a system under simultaneous pressure from multiple directions at once. Let's start with the climate. The evidence for a prolonged drought in the Eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC has grown quite strong in recent decades. Isotope analysis from ancient sediment cores, pollen records from lakes in the Levant and Anatolia, tree ring data showing stress in growth patterns across the region. The convergence of these different lines of evidence points toward a drying period, not a single year of bad harvest, but a prolonged shift, possibly lasting decades, in the rainfall patterns of the Eastern Mediterranean. Harvests begin to fail. Not everywhere, not all at once, but consistently enough that the systems which had depended on reliable food surpluses begin to strain. Here's the thing about the palace states of the late Bronze Age. They were not simple subsistence economies. They were redistributive economies. A palace like Mycenae, or Pylos, or Ugarit didn't just produce food, it coordinated the production, storage, and distribution of food and goods across a large territory. It collected surplus from farmers, stored it in palace granaries, and redistributed it to specialists, soldiers, sailors, scribes, craft workers who couldn't grow their own food because they were doing other things. This works beautifully when there is a surplus to collect. When there isn't, when 3 or 4 years of reduced harvest have eaten through the reserves, when the grain that was supposed to arrive from Egypt hasn't come, because Egypt is also running short, the whole system begins to flex. And the late Bronze Age system had another vulnerability, one that's almost elegant in how precisely it illustrates the problem. Tin. Every bronze implement in the Eastern Mediterranean, every axe head, every sword blade, every set of ship fittings is approximately 90% copper and 10% tin. You cannot make bronze without both. And tin is rare in the Mediterranean world, genuinely rare. The nearest substantial deposits to the Aegean and the Levant are in Sardinia, in Central Europe, in the mountains east of Mesopotamia, possibly as far as Britain or Afghanistan. Exactly where the Bronze Age tin came from is still a subject of serious archaeological debate, but what is clear is that it was being moved vast distances across trade routes that required the coordination of multiple kingdoms, multiple middlemen, and multiple ships. Consider the Uluburun shipwreck, a late Bronze Age merchant vessel discovered off the Turkish coast in 1982, resting 200 feet beneath the Mediterranean. It's one of the most remarkable archaeological finds of the 20th century. This single ship was carrying, at the time it went down, 10 tons of copper ingots shaped like ox hides, the standard unit of Bronze Age copper trade, 1 ton of tin, in exactly the ratio needed to make bronze, Canaanite jewellery, Egyptian scarabs and logs of ebony, Cypriot pottery, Baltic amber from what is today Poland or the Baltic coast, which means it had travelled at least 1,000 miles before it ended up in this ship's hold, and a gold scarab inscribed with the name of Nefertiti. One ship, one voyage, the whole interlocked world, preserved on a sea floor. It is, in its way, one of those small kindnesses that history occasionally offers that a single sunken ship should carry, quite by accident, the whole logic of a lost world. There's a term historians use, cascade failure. It describes what happens when a complex system that has managed to absorb individual shocks begins to fail, not because any one thing breaks, but because multiple things break close enough together in time that the system can no longer compensate. The failure of one component increases the stress on adjacent components, which fail, which increases stress elsewhere, until the whole thing unravels faster than anyone inside it can respond. That is what appears to have happened across the eastern Mediterranean between roughly 1,200 and 1,150 BC. Drought squeezes the food surplus. The reduced surplus strains the palace redistribution systems. Strained palaces have less capacity to maintain trade routes. The trade routes become unreliable. The tin supply grows uncertain. Fewer bronze tools are made. Agricultural productivity falls further. And somewhere in this cascade, people begin to move. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples. They appear in the records of Ramesses III around 1175 BC. Great inscriptions at the Temple of Medinet Habu describing a naval battle, a land battle, and listing the names of the different groups. The Peliset, the Jekka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. We still don't know who they were. That's not a gap the next major excavation will fill. It is a genuine historical uncertainty that scholars have argued about for 100 years without resolution. One theory holds that the Sea Peoples were displaced populations from the collapsing Aegean itself, refugees driven by famine and disorder, moving through the Mediterranean in search of somewhere to go. Another suggests they came from further west, from somewhere in the central Mediterranean. Some think the Egyptian term covered multiple distinct groups moving at the same time, all drawn by the same pressures unraveling the entire network. What the Egyptian records describe is disruption on a massive scale. Hatti gone, Al-Ashir gone, the palaces of the Aegean gone. A whole world coming apart at the same moment. And here is where the story becomes both more human and more heartbreaking. In Pylos, on the western coast of Greece, archaeologists excavated a palace that burned completely around 1180 BC. In the final weeks of the palace's existence, the scribes were writing. Furiously, the Linear B tablets from Pylos's final period record a series of emergency measures, coastal watchers being stationed along the headlands, a specific number of rowers listed by name and home community, a total of around 600 men from 12 different coastal communities being called up for the fleet. Extraordinary religious offerings being sent to the gods. The kind of offerings you make when you are genuinely afraid and not entirely sure the gods are listening. Whether that fleet ever assembled, whether it ever sailed, we don't know. The palace burned. They didn't know they were the last people who would ever write in their language. Linear B, the oldest known form of written Greek, a syllabic script that had served the palace administrators for centuries, disappears from the archaeological record around 1180 BC. After the destruction of Pylos and the other great centres, there are no more tablets, no more records. A writing tradition simply ends, because the institutions that required it and taught it and used it were gone. It will not reappear for 400 years. 4 centuries of silence. 4 centuries in which across the Aegean, the heart of what we would eventually call Western civilization, there is almost no writing at all. There are people, there is pottery, there are communities surviving in the hills, but no records, no correspondence, no accounts. The Greeks who came after, who built the Parthenon, who wrote the Iliad, who gave the world the forms of democracy and philosophy and tragedy that shaped everything that followed. They knew something had existed before them. They could stand in the ruins of the great palaces and see walls made of stone so massive that the people of their own era couldn't explain them. Some of those stones weigh 20 tons. They are fitted without mortar, still standing 3,000 years later. The classical Greeks called them Cyclopean, the work of giants. Because how else do you explain walls built at a scale your entire civilization could not replicate? You don't. You call them heroes. You build a mythology around a gap that your whole culture fell into, and you hold on to the edge of it with stories. And here's the thing those stories lasted. The Iliad, the Odyssey, the great myths of the Bronze Age heroes. They lasted because the gap was real, because the people of classical Greece could feel that something enormous had come before them, even if they couldn't name it. Even if they had to turn it into legend just to make it hold together. They were preserving a memory of a world they no longer had any other way to remember. And so the Bronze Age ends. Not with a single catastrophe, with a cascade. A slow unravelling of everything that had been connected. And in the silence that followed, something new had to begin somewhere far to the east. Along a river most people in the Aegean had never heard of. Hattusa falls next. The Hittite capital had stood for centuries in the highlands of central Anatolia, at the centre of an empire that had once rivaled Egypt in scale and ambition. Its king had corresponded with the pharaoh as an equal. Its armies had faced Ramesses the Great at Kadesh, in a battle so evenly matched that neither side could claim victory, and the two empires had settled, afterward, into one of the oldest peace treaties we have ever recovered. Carved in cuneiform, copies kept in both capitals, witnessed by 1,000 gods from both traditions, sworn to outlast the men who signed it. It did not outlast the world that made it necessary. Sometime in the first decades of the 12th century BC, Hattusa was abandoned. Not conquered in the way we usually picture conquest. No triumphant inscription anywhere boasts of its fall. No rival king claims the credit. The archives simply stop. The administrative quarter burns, though whether by accident, by retreat, or by something else entirely, the ash cannot tell us. And after that fire, no one rebuilds on the same scale ever again. The city that had governed a third of Anatolia becomes, within a generation, a scatter of modest villages sitting on top of the ruins of an empire whose name they may not even have remembered. Here is the thing about the late Bronze Age collapse that makes it different from almost any other ending in the history books. There is no single day you can point to, no single dark chapter with a name. What there is instead is a pattern, the same pattern, repeating, city after city, kingdom after kingdom, like dominoes that do not need to touch each other to fall, because they were never standing on separate ground to begin with. Imar, on the Euphrates, burns and is not resettled. Alalach, in what is now southern Turkey, goes quiet. The palace at Pylos, the one we will return to before the night is through, burns to its foundations. Mycenae's great walls stand, but the world inside them empties out over the following decades. Knossos, on Crete, already diminished by centuries of earlier strain, fades further still. Historians still argue site by site about exactly what happened at each one. A great loss here, turbulent times there, a slow decline somewhere else entirely. But taken together, across 150 years of accumulated evidence, the pattern is unmistakable. Something moved through this world, something the people living inside it could feel arriving before they could ever have named it. The way you sense a change in air pressure long before you understand there is a storm. And into this weakening world came the ships. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples, and in the great relief carved into the temple walls at Medinet Habu, they appear almost featureless. Rows of warriors in horned helmets and feathered headdresses, packed into ships with strange curved prows, families and household goods visible in ox carts behind the fighting men, as if entire communities were moving together, not just armies. Ramesses III claims to have stopped them at the borders of Egypt, in a battle fought partly on the Nile itself, ship against ship, in a scene unlike almost anything else recorded from the ancient world. But notice what the Egyptian record actually shows us. Once you look past the triumphant language carved to flatter a living pharaoh, these do not read like an organized empire arriving with a plan of conquest. They read like people in motion, displaced, searching for land that still worked, in a world where the land that used to work had quietly stopped. We do not know with any certainty where most of them came from. We do not know what language they spoke, or whether the Sea Peoples was ever a name they would have recognized for themselves, or simply a label the Egyptians gave to a wave of arrivals they did not have better words for. That uncertainty is not a gap in the story waiting for the next excavation to fill. It may be a permanent feature of it, a reminder that history does not always hand us names, even for the people who changed everything. Here is the thing worth holding on to. Whoever they were, the evidence increasingly suggests they were symptoms, not the cause. Shadows moving across a system that had already begun to fail, from drought, from tin roots running dry, from palaces that could no longer redistribute what their own people needed simply to get through a season. The ships did not break the Bronze Age world. They arrived at a world already breaking, and found it undefended. Remember the tin. We talked about it earlier tonight. Copper from Cyprus. Tin from somewhere impossibly far, moved across 1,000 miles of sea and mountain pass by ships and caravans that depended on dozens of kingdoms all agreeing, in practice, if not in writing, to let the trade keep moving. Picture that same route again now, differently. The mule train crossing the mountain pass east of the Euphrates. The merchant counting ingots on a dock in Cyprus, tallying the count against a clay receipt. The ship's captain checking the wind before setting out across open water for the Nile. Now picture every link in that chain, one at a time, going quiet. The mountain pass still exists. The mules could still walk it. But the kingdom that once guaranteed safe passage through it no longer has soldiers to spare for guarding caravans. They are needed elsewhere now, defending harvests that failed, cities that have grown afraid. The dock in Cyprus is still standing, but the ships that used to call at it have stopped coming, because the harbours on the other end are burning, or emptied, or simply too uncertain to risk a cargo worth a small fortune. You do not need to break a chain like that with a single blow. You only need enough links to fall quiet, close enough together in time that no one downstream can compensate. And once the bronze stopped moving reliably, once smiths could no longer be certain of getting the tin they needed, when they needed it, something as basic as tool making, weapon making, the ordinary daily maintenance of an entire Bronze Age economy began to falter everywhere at once. Think about what that would have felt like if you were living through it and not simply reading about it centuries later. Not a single terrible morning, a slow accumulation of absences, the trader who used to arrive every spring with tin from the mountains, who simply does not come this year, and then does not come the year after that. The scribe who keeps waiting for a reply to a letter that was sent months ago, and starts, quietly, to suspect it never arrived at all. The watchman on the headland who scans the horizon every evening out of habit, long after the ships he is watching for have stopped being sent. None of that shows up in a single dramatic inscription. It shows up in absence, in storerooms that are never restocked, in workshops where the good bronze tools are used a little longer than they should be, because there is no new tin to replace them, in a harbour that used to smell of pitch and cedar and spice from 6 different countries, and now, most days, smells only of salt and rope in the sea. Here is the thing about a system like this. It had survived shocks before, a bad harvest here, a diplomatic dispute there, a shipwreck that cost one kingdom a season's worth of copper. For 400 years, the network had absorbed disruption after disruption and kept moving, because there was always some slack left somewhere else in the system to take up the strain. What made the 12th century BC different was not any single disruption. It was that, for the first time in living memory, the disruptions arrived faster than the slack could absorb them. Drought layered onto failed harvests, layered onto interrupted trade, layered onto the arrival of people with nowhere left to go. Historians sometimes call this a cascade failure. It is a useful phrase because it reminds us that collapse does not always need a villain. Sometimes it only needs enough ordinary things to go wrong within the same narrow window of years. Silence. Not the silence of nothing happening, the silence of a network that had spent 400 years learning to speak to itself, in 8 languages, across 100 harbours, finally running out of things it could still afford to say. The last king of Ugarit wrote his letter, asking for grain, for ships, for soldiers he did not have. He never learned whether anyone read it. In a small room in that dying city, a scribe would spend his final hours writing exactly that letter, the last words Ugarit ever pressed into clay. In the scribal quarter of Ugarit, in a small room near the palace archive, a man is finishing a letter he does not know will never be sent. His stylus is a reed, cut to a wedge point, and he presses it into a tablet of wet clay held in his left hand, the way he has held 1,000 tablets before this one. The lamp beside him is running low on oil, and he has not called for more, because the household stores are running low as well, and there are more urgent things to ask for than lamp oil. Outside, the harbour is quieter than he has ever known it. No ships have come in for weeks. He can hear, faintly, voices on the palace roof, watchers, posted there since word came that strange vessels had been sighted along the coast to the south. He writes to the king of Al-Ashia, across the water in Cyprus, in the careful diplomatic Akkadian that scribes like him have used for generations to speak kingdom to kingdom. He asks for ships, he asks for grain, he asks plainly for soldiers, because the ones who would normally defend this coast have been sent elsewhere, to another border that seemed, at the time, more urgent. The room smells faintly of damp clay and lamp smoke, and somewhere beneath that, of the sea, the same salt and cedar smell that filled this harbour when it was thriving, though thinner now, as if even the air has grown tired. His fingers are stained grey from the clay he has worked all day. His back aches from bending over the low writing table since before midday prayers. He does not stop to rest. There is not time to rest, and in any case, rest has never made a ship arrive any faster. He finishes the line. He sets the tablet on the shelf with the others, to dry, to be fired, to be sent by the next ship heading east. There is no next ship. We know this letter exists because archaeologists found it, along with dozens of others, some finished, some abandoned mid-sentence, in the ash layer that marks the end of Ugarit. The fire that destroyed the city also, by accident, preserved its final words, the way a kiln hardens clay into something that outlasts everything softer around it. We are, in a very real sense, reading someone's last thoughts, pressed into the earth 3,000 years ago, meant for eyes that never saw them and read instead by us, in the dark, tonight. Here is the thing about that letter. It is not dramatic. It does not know it is the end of anything. It reads like every other request for help that has ever been sent between 2 allies who trust each other to answer. It is bureaucratic. It is ordinary. And that ordinariness is exactly what makes it so quietly devastating. Because the person who wrote it believed, reasonably, based on 4 centuries of precedent, that someone would read it and send help. Ugarit was not naive to believe that. For 400 years, the system had worked. Letters had gone out, and answers had come back. Ships had been requested, and ships had arrived. The world this scribe had been trained to serve was a world where diplomacy functioned, where debts were honoured, where an urgent request from an ally received an urgent response. He had no way of knowing that the entire network, the very thing that made his request reasonable, had already stopped working everywhere else at almost exactly the same time. And so his letter simply waited, in the dark, in the ash, for 3,000 years, until someone dug it up, translated it, and understood, for the first time in 3 millennia, exactly what it had been asking for, and exactly how completely it went unanswered. Here is a strange and quiet comfort in that, if you let it be one. This scribe, whoever he was, and we will never know his name, could not have imagined that his private, urgical ordinary letter would still exist 32 centuries later. That someone, in a warm room lit by something other than an oil lamp, would read his words and feel faintly the same worry he felt writing them. He did not write for us, but we are the ones who finally read him, and maybe that is worth sitting with for a moment before we move on, because the things you do tonight, the small ordinary things, the letters you never send, the requests you make of people you trust, none of us know which of our ordinary moments will turn out to matter, or to whom, or when. Ugarit's scribe was not trying to write something that would last. He was only trying to get through a difficult season. And in trying to get through it, he left behind something that has outlasted almost everything else his civilization built. That is the last we hear from Ugarit. Not a battle, not a villain, a letter that never arrived, and a silence that followed it, and a city that was never rebuilt on the same ground again. So what actually ended the late Bronze Age? Not one thing, not one army, not one drought, not one collapse of any single kingdom. It was the whole interlocked system, trade and climate and food and diplomacy, propping each other up for 4 centuries, failing at close enough to the same time that no part of it could hold up the rest. The tin stopped moving, the grain stopped moving, the ships stopped moving, and when enough of a network goes quiet at once, the whole shape of a world can change within a single generation. Even though almost no one inside it ever sees the whole picture, only their own small piece of the silence. We still live inside networks like that one, webs of trade and food and diplomacy and trust, stretched across distances too vast for any single person to fully picture, each of us seeing only our own corner of it, and quietly, mostly without noticing, trusting that the rest of it holds. Think of the last time you walked down the aisle of an ordinary grocery store, half asleep, reaching for something as unremarkable as coffee or rice or fruit that has no business being in season where you live. None of it arrived by accident. Somewhere a farmer planted it. Somewhere else, a ship or a truck or a train carried it across a border, then another, then another. People you will never meet, speaking languages you may never hear, each doing one small reliable thing, so that the shelf in front of you would not be empty. You did not think about any of that when you reached for it. You were not supposed to have to. That is what a working network feels like from the inside. Invisible until it isn't. The scribe in Ugarit trusted a network like that too. He had every reason to. It had held for 400 years. He simply happened to be the one writing his letter on the day it finally did not. It is a strange thing to think about, lying in the dark. But it is not a frightening one. It is simply true, and it has always been true, for every generation of humans who have ever depended on people they will never meet, in places they will never see. There is something almost tender in that dependence, if you let yourself feel it instead of worrying about it. the sheer quiet trust required to live inside any civilization at all. So let this be where we leave the Bronze Age, not with an army at the gates, with a lamp running low on oil, a letter that never left the room it was written in, and a silence that, 3,000 years later, someone finally learned to read. The Bronze Age world ended, but something else, always, begins in the space that a silence leaves behind. And from the ashes of that particular silence, if you travel far enough to the east, past Mesopotamia, past the mountains of Persia, all the way to a wide, slow-moving river on the other side of the world these people knew, you find a civilization that never seems to have needed an army at all. As you lie here, perhaps starting to drift already, that is perfectly fine. You do not need to hold on to every word from here forward. You are allowed to let some of this wash past you and only catch pieces, the way you might catch pieces of a conversation in another room while you are falling asleep. Nothing that follows requires you to stay fully awake for it. Let the story carry you. That is what it is for, because the air is about to change. The smell of cedar and salt fades. In its place comes something drier, warmer, dustier, the smell of baked brick under a sun that has been beating down on it since before dawn. And beneath that, faintly, the smell of a river close by, slow and brown and enormous. You are no longer on the Mediterranean coast. You have crossed, in the space of a single breath, into a different world entirely. On the other side of Mesopotamia, on the banks of a river the people who lived beside it may have called something like the Sindhu. We call it the Indus. The year is harder to pin down here than it was in Ugarit. The people of this civilization left us no diplomatic archive, no correspondence between kings, nothing we can read that tells us its history the way the tablets did. But by any reasonable estimate, the city rising in front of you has already stood for the better part of 1,000 years by the time the ships stopped coming to the eastern Mediterranean. Its name, as far as we can tell, is lost. Archaeologists simply call it by the name of the modern village nearest the ruins. Mohenjo-daro. Mound of the Dead. It was not always that. Walk with me down one of its streets. Notice, first, that it is straight. Not roughly straight, the way old cities tend to wander around whatever obstacle happened to be there first, but straight, laid out on a grid, running true north to south, crossed by streets running true east to west, as if someone sat down at the very beginning and decided, deliberately, how this city would grow before a single brick was laid. Notice the bricks themselves, fired, not sun-dried, and made to a standard size, the same size, brick after brick, street after street, across a city that, at its height, may have held between 30 and 60,000 people. That kind of standardization does not happen by accident. Somebody, or some institution, decided on a size and enforced it, consistently, for centuries. And notice what runs beneath your feet. Covered drains, built of the same fired brick, run along the edges of the main streets, carrying wastewater away from homes that each have their own private bathing area, a luxury that most cities on Earth would not offer their ordinary residents for another 3,000 years. There are wells. There is what looks very much like a great public bath, a large brick-lined tank set into the heart of the city, waterproofed with a kind of tar big enough to hold a substantial crowd of people at once, its purpose still debated, bathing, ritual, or perhaps both at the same time, in a way that this civilization may never have separated the way we do. Here is the thing that makes archaeologists sit up when they study this place. Nowhere in this city, or in Harappa, its sister city hundreds of miles away, or in any of the hundreds of smaller settlements that shared this same culture, across a territory larger than either Egypt or Mesopotamia at their height, has anyone found a palace. No palace. No obvious royal tomb, heaped with treasure, the way Egypt's kings were buried, or Mesopotamia's. No monumental inscription boasting of a king's conquests. No throne room, No single building that clearly outranks every other building in size or grandeur, the way you would expect if this civilization had organized itself the way nearly every other early civilization did, around the concentrated power of one ruler and one royal household. So who built the drains? Who decided the bricks would all be the same size, across hundreds of settlements, for centuries, without any king to enforce the standard, without any inscription to take credit for it? We do not know. That is not a placeholder for an answer we will find later tonight. It is honestly one of the strangest open questions in the whole story of early civilization, and archaeologists have been arguing about it for 100 years without resolution. But walk a little further with me, away from the drains and the bathing tank, into the narrower streets where the ordinary houses stand shoulder to shoulder in the mid-morning heat. A woman kneels in a small courtyard, turning a wheel with her foot, shaping a bowl out of grey river clay. Beside her, stacked in neat rows to dry in the sun, are dozens more just like it. Functional, unremarkable, the kind of ordinary object that a whole city needs and nobody ever writes a poem about. Her hands are the colour of the clay itself. She does not look up as you pass. There is no reason for her to. You are only a shape at the edge of her attention, the way a stranger passing in the street always is. Further on, a child crouches at the edge of one of the covered drains, dropping small pebbles through the gap in the brickwork one at a time, listening for the faint splash below, entirely absorbed in a game that requires nothing but patience and a stack of pebbles. Somewhere nearby, someone is grinding grain between two flat stones, the sound a slow, steady scrape that carries down the empty street. The smell here is warm dust and baked brick, and underneath it, faintly, wood smoke, and underneath that, the green smell of the river itself, close enough that you could walk to it before the heat of the day became too much. On a low wall near the market street, someone has left a small carved stone seal, no bigger than a coin, showing a bull with a strange curved single horn, and above it, a short row of signs, 5 or 6 symbols, pressed into the stone with obvious care. You could hold it in your palm. Thousands like it have been found across this civilization's cities, on trade goods, on tablets, on the small personal seals that individual merchants seem to have carried the way we might carry a signature stamp. And here is the second great mystery of this place, sitting quietly in your palm. We cannot read it. Not one word. Not one name. Every other great early civilization we have found has eventually given up its language to patient scholars willing to spend a lifetime on it. Egyptian hieroglyphs, Sumerian cuneiform, even the strange syllabic Linear B script we will meet again later tonight. This one has not. Thousands of inscriptions, most of them frustratingly short. 5, 6, 10 symbols at most, never a long passage, never anything resembling a letter or a story, and after more than a century of dedicated effort, we still do not know what a single one of them says. We do not even agree on whether it encodes a spoken language the way our writing does, or whether it functioned more like a system of symbols and marks, useful without needing to sound out. A city with no palace, a script no one can read, a civilization that, by every measure we can find, was orderly, prosperous, and remarkably peaceful. Remarkably few weapons turn up in its ruins. Remarkably little evidence of the fortifications and armories that mark almost every other early civilization we know of, and yet left us no way to hear its own voice, in its own words, telling us who was in charge, or whether anyone needed to be. So we are left, the way we so often are tonight, with the physical evidence and a great deal of honest uncertainty. A grid of streets, a covered drain, a public bath, a small stone seal with a bull, and a handful of unreadable signs. Enough to know that something remarkable was built here. Not quite enough to know, with any certainty, who decided it should be built this way, or why they never felt the need to tell us. That question, whether a civilization can thrive without a single ruler to command it, will follow us through the rest of this city's story. Here's the thing about a city with no king. For a very long time, historians didn't quite believe it was possible. Every other civilization we'd found before this one had followed something like the same shape: a palace at the center, a throne, a tomb heaped with treasure for someone important enough to be remembered by name, armies, inscriptions boasting of conquest. Somewhere, always, a person or a small handful of people standing at the top of a pyramid of power, with everyone else arranged carefully beneath them. Mohenjo-daro doesn't have that. Neither does Harappa, its sister city 500 miles to the north. Neither does any of the hundreds of towns and villages that shared this culture, spread across a territory larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. For roughly 700 years, we tend to assume that a city this size, this organized, this old, must have needed someone in charge. Somebody had to decide the bricks would all be fired to the same standard measurements, and they are the same. Not roughly the same. Across a distance you could not walk in a month. Somebody had to plan the grid of streets and enforce it, generation after generation, long after whoever made the original decision was gone. Somebody had to organize the labor that dug the wells, laid the drains, built the great tank at the heart of the city. Except, that's almost certainly wrong, or at least it isn't the whole story. No palace has ever been found, not at Mohenjo-daro, not at Harappa, not anywhere. No royal tomb, no crown, no throne room, no monument inscribed with any king's name or any king's victories. Compare that to Egypt, where every reign leaves its boast in stone. Compare it to the Mesopotamian cities whose kings list their conquests the way a modern resume lists accomplishments. Here, there is nothing. Not because the evidence was lost. This civilization has been excavated for a century, carefully, patiently, but because, as far as anyone can tell, there was never anything like that to find. What there is instead is standardization without a visible enforcer, a weight system used from one end of this civilization to the other, based on a small cube of stone that comes in exact multiples of the same base unit. 16 small units to one larger one, wherever you find it, whichever city, however far from any other. A brick that measures the same, fired the same way, laid in the same proportions, 4 to 2 to 1 in a city on the coast and a city 500 miles inland. Streets aligned to the same compass points. A sanitation infrastructure so consistent, so deliberately engineered, that houses in the poorest quarters of the city had access to covered drains that most of the world would not build again for 3,000 years. Here's the thing that makes this genuinely strange, if you sit with it for a moment. All of that consistency, and no one seems to have needed to sign their name to it. One idea, and it is only an idea, one among several serious ones, is that this was a civilization run less by kings than by something more like merchant councils or religious authorities, or a class of specialists whose power came from managing trade and resources rather than commanding armies. Grain storage here appears to have been distributed rather than centralized in one great royal granary, the way it was in Egypt. Wealth doesn't concentrate in a handful of enormous burials the way it does almost everywhere else in the ancient world at this scale. If there were elites, and there almost certainly were, someone organized all of this. They don't seem to have needed to announce themselves the way elites nearly everywhere else in the ancient world did. Think about how strange that is. An empire's worth of territory, a shared culture, a shared set of standards, apparently without a shared ruler to hold it together, or at least, without a ruler who left behind the kind of evidence rulers usually leave, which is, admittedly, quite a lot for a century's worth of archaeologists to have to explain to one another over coffee. We don't know. And it's worth sitting with that, honestly, rather than rushing past it toward an answer that feels more comfortable. This isn't a gap waiting for next season's excavation to close. It's one of the genuinely open questions of early civilization, argued over by serious scholars for more than a century, without anything close to consensus. Walk through the residential quarters again, slower this time. Notice how similar the houses are to one another. Not identical, but consistent. Built to comparable plans, with comparable materials whether the family living inside was prosperous or modest. There is far less difference, house to house, than you'd expect in a strongly hierarchical society. No enormous villas towering over cramped, meagre dwellings. No obvious separation of a ruling quarter from an ordinary one. Just streets of solid brick houses, courtyard after courtyard, each with its own well or access to one nearby, each with its own private bathing space and its own connection to the drains running beneath the street outside. Precision numbers, translated, this civilization, at its peak, may have supported as many as 1 million people, spread across more than 1,000 known settlements, on a scale of urban planning and civic infrastructure that some archaeologists compare not to its actual contemporaries in Egypt or Mesopotamia, who built monuments to individual glory but to something closer to a modern municipal government. 1,000 settlements, one shared standard of weights, one style of brick, no named king anywhere among any of it. Maybe that absence isn't a mystery to be solved so much as a mirror held up to an assumption we didn't know. We were making the assumption that order requires a single person to enforce it. Mohenjo-daro doesn't confirm that assumption. It quietly, patiently undermines it. At the heart of the city, sunk into a platform of the same fired brick used everywhere else, sits what archaeologists have come to call the Great Bath, a rectangular tank roughly 12 meters long, waterproofed with a layer of bitumen so effective that water still would not leak out of it today. Steps lead down into it from both ends. Small rooms surround it, perhaps for changing, perhaps for something more ceremonial. No one has found an inscription explaining its purpose, so scholars guess, carefully, based on comparison with much later ritual bathing traditions in this same region, practices that, in some form, persist today, thousands of years and several civilizations removed from the people who first built a tank like this one. There is remarkably little evidence of organized conflict here. Not the absence of tools entirely. A few blades have turned up, spearheads, the ordinary implements a farming society would carry, but no armories. No fortified citadels bristling with defensive walls built to withstand a siege. No mass burials of soldiers. No burned layer marking a sudden ending, the kind we found waiting for us in the last hours of the Bronze Age, the kind that will, notice this now and hold on to it, become a familiar shape again before the night is through. Whatever kept this civilization consistent across 1,000 settlements for 7 centuries, it does not appear to have been an army, and that raises a question we are going to have to sit with, because the answer to it when we finally reach it will not look anything like the answer we got from Ugarit. If a civilization this vast, this organized, this peaceful, eventually stopped, and it did, the cities were abandoned, the script fell silent, the standardized weights and the uniform bricks disappeared from the archaeological record within a few centuries. What does an ending look like when there is no fire to mark it, no army at the gate, no burned palace, no dramatic layer of ash that archaeologists can point to and say, here, on this day, it ended? Consider, too, what has been found in the workshops scattered through this city's quarters. Bead makers working exotic carnelian into ornaments, so finely drilled that modern craftsmen, attempting to reproduce the technique with contemporary tools, have struggled to match the precision. Seals carved from soft stone, each one bearing a handful of the still unread symbols alongside an animal, a bull, an elephant, a rhinoceros, a creature that looks something like a unicorn crossed with a bull, appearing again and again across hundreds of seals in a way that suggests it meant something specific, something shared, something everyone who used these seals would have recognized on sight. Even though we cannot, these seals have been found as far away as Mesopotamia, carried there by traders, evidence of a trade network stretching 1,000 miles to the west, connecting this quiet, kingless civilization to the same interconnected Bronze Age world we left behind in Ugarit on the other side of a continent. Different language, different writing, different way it seems of organizing power itself. and yet the same impulse somehow running underneath all of it. Build something, trade something, standardize something, and trust that the person on the other end of the exchange will honor the terms. That trust, wherever it came from, held for the better part of 700 years. But something did, eventually, change here too. And unlike Ugarit, this ending will not come with a fire, or a letter, or a name we can attach to a single terrible year. Here's the thing about a script no one can read. It isn't just the words that go missing when a language falls silent. It's every voice that ever spoke it. Return to that small stone seal for a moment, the one with the bull, or the elephant, or the strange horned creature, and the row of 5 or 6 symbols pressed above it with obvious care. More than 4,000 of these inscriptions have been recovered from across this civilization's cities. Most are short. A handful of characters, rarely more than 10, never anything resembling a sentence, a story, a name we could actually pronounce, a king we could actually identify. For more than 100 years, scholars have tried to crack it. Some have proposed it encodes an early form of a Dravidian language, ancestral to languages still spoken across southern India today. Others have argued for a connection to Indo-Aryan languages, the family that would eventually produce Sanskrit. A few researchers, controversially, have suggested it may not be a full writing system encoding spoken language at all, but something more like a system of symbols, trademarks, clan emblems, accounting notation functional without ever needing to be read aloud the way a sentence is. We don't know which of these is right. That is not a placeholder for an answer arriving soon. Every major attempt at decipherment, using every computational technique available to modern linguistics, has run into the same wall. The inscriptions are simply too short, and there are too few of them, to establish the kind of statistical patterns that cracked ancient Egyptian or cuneiform. So we are left holding a seal, a scatter of symbols, a bull with one curved horn, and silence where the story should be. And here's a thought worth sitting with in that silence. Maybe not knowing is, itself, a kind of information. It tells us that whatever this civilization valued enough to write down, it either didn't value the kind of grand self-declaration that Egypt and Mesopotamia carved into every temple wall, or it recorded that self-declaration somewhere we haven't found yet, on some material that didn't survive 4,000 years the way fired clay and carved stone did. Either way, the silence is not empty. It's simply a silence we haven't yet learned to hear. Consider what 4,000 of these tiny inscriptions do tell us, even without being readable. They tell us this civilization used writing constantly, casually, the way we use a signature or a barcode, not for grand pronouncements, but for the ordinary business of moving goods, marking ownership, sealing a jar of grain before it left one merchant's hands and entered someone else's ledger. A city that doesn't need writing to glorify its king might still need writing desperately to keep its trade honest. That too is a kind of civilization, quieter, less interested in being remembered than in simply functioning day after day, season after season, for the people actually living inside it. Now, the second mystery, the quieter one, the one without any fire at all. Sometime around 1900 BC, a little earlier in some places, a little later in others, the great cities of this civilization begin, gradually, to empty out, not all at once, not suddenly. Mohenjo-daro's population declines over generations, not months. Streets that have been kept meticulously maintained for centuries start to see smaller houses built carelessly over what had once been carefully planned public spaces. The uniform bricks stop being quite so uniform. The distant trade with Mesopotamia, the seals that once turned up 1,000 miles from home slow and then stop. There is no burned layer here, no mass burial, no inscription from any neighbouring power boasting of a conquest, and there were neighbouring powers who would have had every reason to boast if there had been anything to boast about. Whatever happened to this civilization, it does not appear to have been a war. It appears, as best the evidence can tell us, to have been something closer to a slow, patient unravelling the same shape, in its way, as the network that ended in Ugarit, but stretched across centuries instead of decades, and without a single scribe left behind to write a letter describing what was happening. The leading explanation, still debated, points toward the rivers. The Indus river system in this period appears to have shifted a major tributary. The one modern scholars call the Cahokia seems to have dried up or changed course, possibly due to changes in monsoon patterns across the wider region, possibly compounded by tectonic shifts changing the landscape the rivers ran through. Agriculture that had depended on predictable flooding, the same kind of predictable abundance the Nile gave Egypt for millennia, would have grown less predictable, harvest by harvest, generation by generation, not a crisis in a single terrible year, a great scarcity, arriving slowly enough that no single person living through it could point to the day it started. Here's the thing about a decline like that. It doesn't need a villain, because it doesn't announce itself as an enemy. It simply asks a question, quietly, year after year, is it still worth staying here? And eventually, city by city, family by family, the answer becomes no. People appear to have simply moved towards smaller settlements, toward the east, toward regions with more reliable water, not fleeing an army, walking patiently toward somewhere the rain still came. Picture, for a moment, one particular house in the oldest quarter of Mohenjo-daro, in what might have been among its final years. The well in the courtyard has been dug deeper twice already, chasing a water table that keeps retreating. The drain outside, once swept and maintained by some civic hand we will never identify, has begun to silt up, unrepaired, because there are fewer hands left to repair it, and other things have become more urgent. Dust drifts in through a doorway that used to be swept every morning. Somewhere close by, a family is packing what they can carry, grain, a few clay seals, whatever pottery survives the journey, onto a cart bound east, toward a tributary that still, this year, carries water. They do not know they are among the last people who will ever live in this house. They only know that this year, like the last several years, has been harder than the one before it, and that somewhere else the harvest might still be reliable. We have now stood inside two silences in a single night, the fire that ended Ugarit, and the slow retreat of the water that ended this city on the Indus, and it's worth noticing how differently they arrived, even though they led to the same place. One ends in ash you can point to on a single stratigraphic layer, the other simply thins out across 150 years of ordinary decisions made by ordinary people trying to stay somewhere the rain still came. Endings, it turns out, don't need to look alike to be endings. Some vanish behind you all at once. Others just get a little quieter each year, and you don't notice for the first several years that they have started disappearing at all. We began this chapter of the night with a city that built covered drains for its poorest residents, standardized bricks with no king to enforce the standard, and a writing system we cannot read. We end it with those same cities, quietly emptying, over generations, into a silence with no fire and no name attached to it, a vanishing so gentle that for a very long time no one even realized a great civilization had been there at all, until archaeologists literally tripped over its bricks while looking for something else entirely, and had no idea at first what they had found. A city with no king, a script with no voice, an ending with no villain. Here's the thing that connects them, if you let it. This was not a smaller, lesser story than the one we just left behind in the Aegean. It may, in its own quiet way, be evidence of something even rarer, a civilization vast enough to leave 4,000 years of consistent bricks in the ground, that never seems to have needed to conquer anyone to get there. Fast forward now. Cross an ocean most of the people in either of these cities never knew existed. Somewhere on the other side of the world, on the banks of a river as wide and as patient as the one you just left, another city was about to rise, one that most history books, even now, have simply never mentioned. If you're still with me, and it's alright if you're not, it's alright if the last few minutes went by without you catching every word. Let this be a gentle place to rest for a moment before we go on. You don't need to remember any of what you just heard. None of it will be on a test. Let it settle into the back of your mind the way sand settles at the bottom of still water, and let's simply keep going, together, a little slower now, because the air is changing again. Salt and cedar, baked brick and river silt, both of those are behind you now. What's here instead is something greener damp earth after rain, wood smoke drifting low over water, the mineral smell of a wide brown river that has been rising and falling with the seasons since long before anyone stood on its banks to notice. Cross an ocean with me. Not the Atlantic as a modern ship would cross it. Nobody here has any idea that an ocean like that even exists, in either direction, and won't for another 600 years. But cross, in your mind, all the same, because we are leaving the old world behind entirely now, for the first time tonight, and arriving somewhere that developed almost every one of its own ideas about cities and meaning, without a single word of influence from anything we've visited so far. The year is somewhere around 1100 AD. You're standing in the river bottoms near the confluence of two great rivers, one that runs the length of a continent, another that meets it here, in what will one day be called Illinois, directly across from a much smaller settlement that will, many centuries later, become the city of St. Louis. In front of you rises a mound, not a small one, not a burial hill of the kind that dots much of the countryside for miles around, though there are plenty of those here too. This one, later generations will call it Monk's Mound, after monks who lived nearby centuries after this civilization was gone, rises roughly 30 meters into the air, built entirely by hand, one basket load of packed earth carried and laid at a time, across generations, until its base alone covers more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Around it, more than 100 other mounds rise from the floodplain platform mounds for important buildings, burial mounds, mounds whose purpose no one has fully agreed on, arranged with the same kind of deliberate, careful planning we noticed in the streets of Mohenjo-daro, on the other side of the world, in a civilization that never knew this one existed, and never will. This is Cahokia. At its height, sometime between 1050 and 1000, 200 AD, as many as 10 to 20,000 people may have lived here, spread across the city itself and the farming communities surrounding it. That made it, at the time, larger than London, larger than Paris. One of the largest cities anywhere on Earth, built entirely from earth, wood, and the patient coordinated labour of people who left behind no metal tools, no wheeled vehicles, no writing system of the kind we've met so far tonight, and yet organised enough to move an almost unimaginable volume of soil, basket by basket, into a shape still visible from an airplane window today. Here's the thing worth sitting with gently, as you let your eyes close if they haven't already. Most people, even people who grew up in the towns and cities scattered across this same stretch of the Mississippi River today, have never heard the name Cahokia, a city that once rivaled the great capitals of medieval Europe in size, sits quietly under a state park a few miles from a modern highway, visited by a fraction of the people who visit far smaller, far more famous ruins on other continents. A city larger than London, at the very same moment London was becoming the city we'd recognise today. A city visible from space, sitting a short drive from a modern American interstate, and yet, ask almost anyone, anywhere, to name the largest city in North America before Columbus arrived, and Cahokia is rarely the answer they give. We'll come back to that particular puzzle, why a place this size could become this invisible, a little later tonight. Once we've spent more time here, among the mounds, in the quiet of this river morning, below the mound stretches the Grand Plaza, a levelled, artificially flattened space larger than several modern city blocks, built by filling in a natural swale with untold cubic meters of soil so that ceremonies, games, and gatherings could take place on ground as level as the builders could make it. On mornings like this one, it fills slowly with people, Traders arriving with baskets of goods from as far away as the Gulf Coast and the Great Lakes seashells, copper, mica sheets thin enough to let light glow softly through them, all things that had travelled hundreds of miles over rivers and trails to reach this single plaza at the heart of the continent. To the west of the mound stands a circle of enormous wooden posts, evenly spaced, that archaeologists have come to call Woodhenge, a name that borrows, half affectionately, from a much older stone circle on another continent entirely, one this civilization never saw and never heard of. The posts appear to align with the rising sun at specific points across the year, the solstices, the equinoxes, suggesting that whoever built this had watched the sky carefully, for a long time, and decided its rhythms were worth marking permanently, in wood, at the very center of their city. Here's the thing about a civilization like this one. It built no palace, either not in the sense Egypt or the Bronze Age Mediterranean would have recognized. What it built instead were mounds, plazas, a wooden calendar watching the horizon, and a level of coordinated labor that, by some estimates, required moving over 50 million cubic feet of earth, one basket at a time, across less than 2 centuries. However, power worked here, and we still argue about exactly how it was expressed less in individual monuments to a single ruler's name, and more in shared, monumental works that an entire community built together, generation folding into generation, the way a river builds a delta. Near the plaza's edge, a young man crouches over a smooth, disc-shaped stone, rolling it across the packed earth ahead of him while 2 others sprint after it, hurling long poles toward the spot where they guess it will finally stop. It's a game, Chunky. Later peoples up and down this same river valley will still be playing something very much like it, centuries after Cahokia itself has gone quiet, carrying the rules forward the way a favourite story gets carried from one generation's fireside to the next, long after everyone forgets exactly where it started. For now, though, it is simply a game, played at the base of an enormous mound on an ordinary morning by people who have absolutely no reason to believe that any of this, the mound, the plaza, the wooden circle watching the solstice sun, will ever need remembering. It is simply their city. It is simply this morning. It is, for now, simply home. There is more to see here before the light changes the people who filled this plaza, the lives they built in its shadow, and gently the story of why they eventually let it go quiet. By mid-morning, the plaza is full. Not full the way a stadium fills for an event nobody has staged a spectacle for today. Full the way an ordinary market square fills on an ordinary morning, when there is work to be done and people to see, and time enough left before the heat of early afternoon settles heavy over the river bottom. Smell comes first here, the way it almost always does. Wood smoke, low and drifting across packed earth. Beneath it, something sweeter maize roasting somewhere near the base of the mound, and underneath that, the green, faintly bitter smell of squash vines still wet with morning dew. Somewhere close by, someone is cracking sunflower seeds and sorting them, one small handful at a time, into a shallow woven basket. A woman sits near the plaza's edge, working a strand of shell beads through her fingers. The shells are marine whelk, carried here from the Gulf Coast, hundreds of miles south, passed hand to hand along river routes that this city sits close to the very center of. She has drilled each bead herself, with a stone tool no larger than her thumb, and she is stringing them now into a pattern she has made before, and will make again. A necklace, it turns out, for her daughter, who is playing somewhere near the mound's base with 2 other children, half watching a game of Chunky that has already drawn a small, murmuring crowd of onlookers. She does not look up often. Her hands know this work well enough that her eyes are free to wander, and mostly, they wander toward her daughter. Here's the thing worth sitting with, gently, in this particular moment. We do not know this woman's name. We will never know it. No inscription survives to tell us. No correspondence. No scribe pressing her story into clay the way the scribes of Ugarit once did for kings and trade disputes. And yet the shells in her hands, the pattern she is threading, the daughter she keeps glancing toward, none of that requires a name to have been real. It only requires us to imagine it carefully and honestly from what her hands and this plaza and the thousands of beads like hers still buried in the ground beneath your feet have quietly left behind. It is easy, from 9 centuries away, to see only the mound, the scale of it. 30 meters of packed earth, a plaza the size of several city blocks, a wooden circle watching the solstice sun with a patience no clock could match. But scale, on its own, was never what made this a city. A city is made of ordinary mornings like this one, beads threaded, seeds cracked, a game played at the edge of a murmuring crowd, a mother watching her daughter instead of her own hands. At its height, remember, Cahokia may have held 10 to 20,000 people larger at the time than London, larger than Paris. And here is that same thought again, said a little differently now. Somewhere in Europe, that same century, someone else was also threading beads for a daughter in a city we have heard of, whose language we still speak, whose kings we can still name. The real difference between that city and this one was never size or sophistication. It was only ever which stories got written down and by whom, and which were left instead to the slow, patient evidence of packed earth and drilled shell. Traders line the plaza's far edge. Some have come from the Gulf Coast, baskets heavy with shell, others from the north, near the Great Lakes, carrying copper hammered so thin it catches the morning light like something almost liquid. Mica, cut into shapes like open hands, has travelled here from the Appalachian foothills, hundreds of miles east. None of it moved by wagon, none of it moved by anything with a wheel. It moved by river, by canoe, by foot, along a network that, at its furthest edges, touched nearly a third of this continent, which is, quietly, a rather ambitious piece of logistics for a civilization that had, quite deliberately, never bothered with the wheel. Think, for a moment, about the last time you stood in a line at a market somewhere, trading a few small coins for something grown a short distance away, surrounded by people you don't especially know, but nonetheless share an ordinary morning with. That particular impulse, trade as much for connection as for necessity, is not a modern invention. It is closer to a very old habit of simply being human one. This plaza was already practicing 9 centuries before anyone standing in it had ever heard the word market. Near the mound's base, a man is teaching a boy, his son, perhaps, or a nephew, the exact relation lost to us the way so much here is lost, how to nap a stone blade, striking flint against flint with the unhurried, repetitive rhythm of someone who has done this 10,000 times and is trying, gently, to make it look easier than it actually is. The boy misses more than he hits. The man does not seem to mind. There is, in the patient way, he resets the boy's grip and nods for him to try again. Something that needs no translation across 900 years. The particular, universal patience of teaching a child a skill that once took you years to learn yourself. None of this, the beads, the copper, the flint, the game still drawing its small crowd near the mound, was ever written down. Not because this civilization had nothing worth writing. As far as the evidence can tell us, they never developed, or perhaps simply never needed, a system of writing the way Ugarit did, or attempted one the way the Indus did with its seals we still cannot read. What they left instead was earth, and shell, and stone, and the quiet shape of a city built entirely by hands, for people, at a scale historians are only now beginning to take fully seriously. Here's the thing about noticing all of this together, from the quiet of wherever you're lying tonight. Nothing about an ordinary life requires permanence in order to have mattered. This woman's hands did not know they were being watched by anyone at all. Least of all by you, 900 years later, drifting towards sleep in a room she could never have imagined existing. And yet here you are, and here, in whatever quiet way memory allows, she still is threading beads, watching her daughter, in a plaza you have now, in your own way, briefly shared with her. But a city this alive rarely stays quiet about why it eventually goes still. and Cahokia's own answer to that question was already, slowly, taking shape beneath everything you've just seen. Somewhere in the 13th century, the Plaza begins, slowly, to change. Not overnight. Nothing here ends overnight. You may be noticing, by now, that almost nothing in any of these ages ends the way the stories we're used to tend to promise, with a single dramatic night, a villain, a battle you could point to on a single afternoon. What happens instead, here as before, is quieter than that, and in its own way, harder to see coming. The mounds stop growing, not abruptly simply. At some point, no new basket loads of earth are added to the great mound at the city's centre, and no one alive at the time seems to have marked the occasion, because there was likely no single occasion to mark. Construction on this scale requires an enormous, ongoing commitment of labour, season after season, generation after generation, and at some point, that commitment simply stops being renewed. Archaeologists point to several pressures converging, none of them large enough on its own to explain what happened, all of them large enough together. The climate across this stretch of the continent appears to have shifted, cooling and growing less predictable in the centuries after Cahokia's peak, a change that, elsewhere in the world, in this same broad window of centuries, unsettled harvests from Greenland to the Alps. Here, along the river, that meant less reliable maize yields, in a city that had grown to depend on maize surpluses the way the palace states of the Bronze Age once depended on grain. There is also the matter of the woodland itself, building and rebuilding a wooden palisade around the city's central precinct. And there was one, replaced more than once across the city's history, along with fuel for cooking fires for tens of thousands of people, year after year, for 2 centuries, would have required cutting a great deal of timber from the forests surrounding the city. Some researchers believe that clearing the woodland altered the local water table and increased flooding risk across the very bottomlands the city's farms depended on. It's a pattern that will feel familiar by the time we reach the last age of this evening. A civilization, however unintentionally, straining the very resources that had allowed it to grow so large in the first place. And there is the river itself. The waters here flood, by nature, on a rhythm that shaped this landscape long before any human city stood beside it. Evidence suggests that flooding in this period grew more frequent, more severe, harder to plan a harvest around turning what had once been a dependable, life-giving rhythm into something closer to a great scarcity, arriving unpredictably, season after season, in a place that had built its entire food system around predictability. None of this needed to be a single crisis to matter. A run of poor harvests here, a flood that ruins a planting season there, a winter colder than the elders can remember. None of it, on its own, ends a city. All of it, together, over enough years, asks the same quiet question the Indus Valley once asked its own people, in its own slow way. Is it still worth staying here? And generation by generation, family by family, the answer here seems to have become no. People appear to have simply left. Not in a single exodus, but gradually, household by household, over the better part of a century towards smaller settlements scattered along the river system, toward places where the land still cooperated a little more generously. Within a few generations, the great plaza that once drew traders from the Gulf Coast and the Great Lakes stood largely empty. The mounds remained, they still stand today, outlasting every wooden building that ever stood on top of them, but the tens of thousands of ordinary mornings that once filled the plaza between them had simply, quietly, stopped happening. Here's the thing worth holding on to, gently, before we leave this river behind. A city larger than London, in its own century, disappeared so completely from common memory that for a long time afterward, later settlers arriving in this same river valley assumed the mounds must have been built by someone else entirely. Anyone but the ancestors of the native people still living nearby, because they found it difficult to imagine that the people they were displacing could have built something this large. That assumption was wrong. It was, in its own quiet way, one more kind of forgetting, layered on top of an ending that had already been gentle enough to slip past memory once. And maybe that's worth sitting with tonight, wherever you are, because forgetting, it turns out, isn't only something that happens to the very old, the very distant, the civilizations separated from us by unreadable scripts and vanished languages. It can happen to a city larger than a European capital, on the same continent millions of people call home right now. What humanity forgets is not always ancient. Sometimes it is simply unwatched. We began this river's story with a mound rising against a morning sky, and a game drawing a small crowd near its base. We leave it with a plaza gone quiet, not from fire, not from conquest, but from the same accumulating, ordinary pressures that have shaped nearly every ending we have visited tonight. Pressures that ask nothing dramatic of history, only enough time, and enough quiet decisions to eventually change everything. If a city this size, on this continent, could slip from memory within a few centuries, despite mounds still visible from the air today, imagine how much more easily an entire continent's history could be set aside, misunderstood, or simply left unheard by the wider world. Half a world away, on a hillside in southern Africa, that is almost exactly what happened next. As you drift here, further into the night than you were an hour ago, let this be another gentle place to rest, if you need one. You don't have to follow every word from here forward. Some of what comes next may simply become part of the backdrop of your own sleep, and that is exactly as it should be, because we're crossing an ocean again, and a great deal of time along with it. The air, when it changes this time, turns dry and warm, carrying dust and the smell of sun-baked grass, and beneath that faintly, wood smoke from cooking fires scattered across a hillside. Cattle low, somewhere in the middle distance. Wind moves steadily across open grassland, the kind of wind that has nothing in its way for miles. The year is somewhere between 1000, 200 and 1450 AD, a wide window, because unlike Ugarit's tablets, or even the Indus seals, this civilization left us no written calendar of its own, only stone, and the patient work of archaeologists piecing together its centuries from what that stone, and what lies buried around it, can tell us. You are standing on a granite hillside in what is today southern Zimbabwe, looking up at walls that, in the low light of late afternoon, glow faintly orange-gold, the same colour as the stone they're carved from. These are not walls built the way most ancient walls were built. There is no mortar anywhere in them, not a trace. Every stone, and there are, in the largest of these enclosures, hundreds of thousands of them, has been shaped and fitted by hand, so precisely that it holds itself in place purely through the careful geometry of its own weight, block resting on block, for wall after curving wall, several meters high in places, running for hundreds of meters along the contour of the hill. Reach out and touch it, if you can imagine doing so. The stone is warm from a full day of sun, rough under your palm, and utterly, deliberately solid. This is Great Zimbabwe, a name that, fittingly, simply means great stone houses in the Shona language still spoken across this region today, a language whose speakers are, in every meaningful sense, the descendants of the people who built these walls. At its height, sometime around the 14th century, this city may have held somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people, a capital at the centre of a trading kingdom that stretched across a significant part of the region, drawing wealth from gold mined further inland and cattle herded across its grasslands. Walk into the largest enclosure, the one archaeologists call the Great Enclosure, and you'll find, at its centre, a conical stone tower, solid, purposeful, its meaning still debated, perhaps ceremonial, perhaps a monument to the kingdom's granaries, perhaps something this culture never explained because everyone who lived here already understood it without needing to be told. And here, once again, is a scale comparison worth sitting with. The stonework beside you was already old, already carrying the weight of centuries. Roughly around the same era, the great cathedrals of medieval Europe were being raised, different tools, different materials, an entirely different relationship to stone, and yet both, in their own way, monuments built to outlast the people who built them. Trade moved through here on a scale that surprises most people encountering this place for the first time. Excavations at Great Zimbabwe have recovered glass beads from India, porcelain fragments from China, carried across the Indian Ocean by dhow, then inland by caravan, hundreds of miles from the nearest coast. Gold worked into intricate ornaments, some of it likely destined for Swahili coast trading cities, and from there, onward, into networks that eventually touched the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. This was not an isolated kingdom, tucked away from the wider world. It was one node, a significant one in a trade network, that connected the interior of southern Africa to the Indian Ocean world, and through it, distantly, to nearly everywhere else you've visited tonight. Here's the thing worth holding on to, gently. When outside travelers first encountered these ruins in more recent centuries, many of them simply refused to believe that African hands had built them. They proposed instead elaborate theories almost anyone but the ancestors of the people living in the villages nearby, who had never stopped telling their own histories of this place, and had never once claimed the walls were built by anyone else. It took the patient, decades-long work of archaeologists working, at times, directly against the assumptions of the era they lived in to establish clearly what should never have been in doubt: that Great Zimbabwe was built, entirely, by the ancestors of Shona-speaking peoples who still live across this region today. It is a strange and quiet kind of erasure, this one not a city ending in fire, not a slow retreat from a changing river, but something closer to a history that continued to exist, told by the very people who had always told it, while much of the wider world outside simply declined, for a very long time, to listen. Turbulent times, elsewhere, and shifting attention made it easier for a great deal of this region's own history to be set aside, rather than studied a different kind of forgetting than any we've visited so far tonight, born less from silence in the ground, and more from silence in who was doing the listening. And there is still a genuine mystery here, one that belongs beside the questions we've carried through every stop tonight. Why, precisely, this hillside? Why the trading kingdom that grew from it eventually declined too? Sometime in the 15th century, its wealth and population gradually shifting elsewhere, to other centres, for reasons still argued over resource pressures, once again, and shifting trade routes, and possibly, once again, a changing climate reshaping what this landscape could support. The walls remain, precise, mortarless, glowing gold in late light. What we still don't fully know is exactly who first decided this particular hill deserved a monument like this one, and exactly why so much of the world, for so long afterward, chose not to ask. There is still more to learn here about what these walls left behind, and about gratitude, and about legacy, and that part of the story, gently, continues next. The stone stays warm under your palm long after the sun has dipped below the ridge. That warmth granite holding a whole day's heat after dark, releasing it slowly, the way stone always does, is one of the small, sensory facts about this place that no photograph has ever quite captured. You can stand in a picture of these walls and understand their scale, their precision, the improbable, mortar-free patience of their construction, but you cannot feel in a photograph what it is like to press your hand to stone this old, at this hour, and find it still warm. The walls of the great enclosure curve around you in the low evening light. They are, by any reasonable measure, one of the most impressive pieces of dry stone construction anywhere on Earth, 5 meters high in places, a meter thick, built with a precision that modern engineers, examining them carefully, tend to describe with something that sounds distinctly like respect. The outer wall alone runs for more than 250 meters. Every stone in it was placed by hand, shaped by hand, fitted by someone who understood, without any instrument more complex than an eye trained over years, exactly where a block needed to go in order for the wall to stand. Here's the thing about gratitude in a place like this. It is not the simple kind. We are late to notice this place. We are late to take it seriously. We are late, in the broader sweep of history, in the way that many things that happen on this continent have been consistently, structurally late in reaching the attention of the world's history books, not because they were hidden, or small, or poorly preserved, but because the people doing the looking were often, for a very long time, not looking with the intention of finding something worth their attention. The walls of Great Zimbabwe were built, flourished, and were quietly acknowledged by local peoples across centuries of unbroken oral tradition. The Shona people have never needed outside confirmation to know that these walls are theirs. They knew. They have always known. What changed over the last century is that the wider world of academic history finally stopped arguing about whether African builders could have built something this precise, and started actually listening to what the people who had been living beside these walls the whole time were saying. And what they were saying, it turns out, is both simpler and more moving than any of the elaborate alternative theories ever were. These are the walls our ancestors built. This was a great city. This is where the kingdom was. That's it. No mystery, no missing civilization, just a clear, continuous tradition of people who never forgot, pointing at stone walls that never disappeared, in a place where the history was never actually lost, only ignored. There is a kind of gratitude due here that doesn't have a clean form, because it is tangled up with a great deal of less comfortable history. But here is the simplest version of it, that Great Zimbabwe is still standing, that the walls are still warm in the evening, that the oral traditions that held this history were strong enough to outlast a very long period of not being listened to, and that the archaeology of the last century has, with whatever imperfect slowness, eventually come around to confirming what was never, in this place, actually in doubt. The conical tower rises near the centre of the great enclosure, solid and deliberately unremarkable in its outer form, no entrance, no window, no visible function that translates easily into modern categories. It is roughly 11 meters tall. It was built at the same time as the walls around it, from the same granite to the same mortarless standard. What it meant to the people who built it may never be fully recoverable from the outside, because it was likely the kind of meaning that lived inside a living tradition rather than in any inscription, and the tradition it lived inside has had to survive, for several centuries, significant disruption before anyone else started asking. Perhaps it was a granary tower, its solid form signalling abundance to those who understood the symbol. Perhaps it was a marker of chiefly authority, the architectural equivalent of a declaration. Perhaps it was both, and several other things besides, in the way that meaningful symbols rarely settle into a single explanation. We look at it, in the warm evening air, and we hold the uncertainty the way we've held every uncertainty tonight, as an honest gap, not a failure, not a mystery requiring a dramatic solution, but simply a piece of the past that has not yet made itself fully legible to people who arrived a little late and are still, slowly, learning to listen. Here's the quietest thought to carry forward from this wall. The civilizations that have spoken to us most clearly tonight are often the ones that left the most obvious monuments. Ugarit, with its archive of clay tablets, burned and preserved. Mohenjo-daro, with its standardized bricks and its 1,000 years of accumulated ground plan. And the ones that have required the most patience, the most willingness to sit with uncertainty and honest ignorance, are often the ones whose stories survive not in stone, but in people, in a continuous thread of human memory that ran through every generation, whether the wider world was paying attention or not. Great Zimbabwe is still here. Its builders' descendants are still here. That is not the ending of a story. That is what it looks like when a story was never actually interrupted, only overlooked. Now the night is deepening, and we are going back, further than anything we have visited so far, further than the Bronze Age, further than the Indus, further than Cahokia or these warm golden walls, all the way back to a mountain in what is today southeastern Turkey, and a site so old that when its builders were alive, the Sahara was green. Let the night deepen around you now. We have one more place to visit, and it is the oldest, the farthest back, the one that sits in the long timeline of everything we've touched tonight, the way the very first note of a piece of music sits before all the others there before any of them, shaping everything that follows without the things that follow ever quite explaining it. The air here is cool. We are in the mountains, not the flat river lowlands of the Indus, not the Mississippi's wide green bottoms, not the warm granite hillside we just left. The elevation is high enough here that the nights carry a genuine chill, even after a warm day, and the stars, when there are no clouds, are the kind of stars that most people alive today have never seen, not because the stars have changed, but because the light below them has. The year is approximately 10,000 BC. To put that number in proportion, Mohenjo-daro, one of the oldest cities we visited tonight, was built roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. The late Bronze Age collapse happened roughly 3,000 years ago. Cahokia's peak was only 900 years ago. Go back 2,000 years from Mohenjo-daro, then another 2,000 beyond that, and you still haven't reached the people standing on this hilltop. And here is the thing that makes this particular moment in history so genuinely strange. The people building here, right now, have not yet learned to farm. No one on Earth in 10,000 BC has domesticated wheat. The agricultural revolution, the shift to settled farming that would, within the next 2,000 years, make possible every city we have visited tonight, every surplus, every palace, every seal stamped with an unreadable script is still in the future. These people are hunter-gatherers. They follow game. They gather plants. They are highly mobile, living in ways that leave almost no permanent marks on the landscape. Except here, because here, on this limestone hilltop in the mountains of what is today southeastern Turkey, they have been quarrying and shaping enormous T-shaped stone pillars, some of them 6 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons, and arranging them in careful circles, 2 tall central pillars surrounded by shorter ones, each carved with images of animals in startling detail: snakes, foxes, vultures, boars, ducks, spiders, all of them pressed into limestone with a technical confidence that implies years of accumulated practice. In a tradition we cannot trace back further than this hill. This site is called Göbekli Tepe. In Turkish it means Potbelly Hill, which is, given what's been found there, perhaps the most modest name in the history of archaeology. Here's what makes Göbekli Tepe so genuinely difficult to fit into the story we thought we knew. Every other monumental site we have ever found, Stonehenge, the Egyptian pyramids, the temples of Mesopotamia, every large-scale building project that required coordinating hundreds or thousands of workers over extended periods was built by settled agricultural societies. Societies that had developed the surplus food, the population density, and the organizational complexity that agriculture makes possible. Göbekli Tepe's builders had none of that. They were mobile. They had no grain stores. They had no palace. They had no redistributive economy of the kind we described in the Bronze Age, and yet they moved 20-ton stones. For perhaps 1,000 to 1,500 years, people returned to this hill and built here. And at the end of that period, rather than abandoning the site to the elements, they appear to have deliberately, carefully buried it, filling the enclosures with clean soil and rubble, sealing them in, preserving the pillars, the carvings, the careful circles of stone, in a state of suspension that kept them largely intact until a Kurdish shepherd noticed an unusual number of exposed limestone slabs in the mid-1990s. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt heard about the find. He drove to the site, looked at the exposed stone, and reportedly said that if this was what it appeared to be, it would change everything. It was. It did. What Göbekli Tepe changed is the assumed direction of the relationship between agriculture and religion, between farming and monument building. The old story was, first people farm, then they get surplus, then they get complex society, then they build temples. Göbekli Tepe suggests something more unsettling and more interesting. What if the temple came first? What if the impulse to gather, to build something sacred together, To mark the sky and the animals and the passage of seasons in stone predates farming and may, in fact, have been part of what eventually drove people to begin farming in the first place, in order to feed the gatherings that this place seems to have required. That's a hypothesis. It is contested, but it is taken seriously by serious archaeologists, and it matters because it inverts something we thought we understood about our own origins, the idea that surplus enables culture, rather than culture enabling surplus. Now let's step back one more time, even further, to understand the world these builders lived in, before Göbekli Tepe, before the last of the great ice retreated. About 11,700 years ago, the Earth came out of a long, cold period called the Younger Dryas. If you were a human alive in that era, and humans had been fully modern, cognitively and physically, for at least 50,000 years. By this point, what you experienced as the Younger Dryas ended was not a gradual thaw. It was, by geological standards, shockingly fast. Ice core records from Greenland suggest that mean annual temperatures in some parts of the northern hemisphere rose by as much as 10 degrees Celsius within a span of roughly 10 years. 10 years. The kind of change that, in human lifetime terms, would go from one world to almost another within a single generation's memory. Consider what that means practically. Grasslands that had been frozen or semi-arid for generations became warmer and wetter. Plants spread into new territory with extraordinary speed. Animals followed. Human populations, which had been spread thin across a cold, challenging landscape, found themselves suddenly in a world of relative abundance, more game, more plant foods, milder winters, more reliable water, and crucially, more of each other. With abundance comes population growth. With population growth comes the practical necessity of figuring out how to live together in larger groups, how to store food, how to organize the work of feeding more people than any single band of hunters had needed to feed before. The agricultural revolution, which transformed human life so completely and so quickly that its effects are still playing out in everything you see around you, did not emerge because a single clever person invented farming. It emerged, probably in multiple places at roughly the same time, the Fertile Crescent, parts of China, eventually this same part of southeastern Turkey, as a series of gradual, accumulated adaptations to a world that had suddenly become warm enough and dense enough with people that the old ways of getting food were no longer quite sufficient to feed everyone. And Göbekli Tepe sits, in the archaeological timeline, almost exactly at this hinge. Not quite before agriculture, not quite after it. At the very moment when the world was becoming warm enough, and human groups were becoming large enough, for something like this, a temple, a gathering place, a monument to the animals and the sky that hunter-gatherers had lived with, and watched and drawn on cave walls for 50,000 years to become possible. That timing may not be a coincidence. Sit with that thought for a moment, if you can. The same warming that made farming possible may also have made Göbekli Tepe possible. By concentrating populations, creating larger and more complex gatherings, generating the organizational capacity to move 20-ton stones. And the monument that those gatherings built in turn may have created the social pressure to develop food surplus systems capable of feeding the people who kept coming here. If that story is even partially right, what it means is that the very first monument ever built by human hands, or at least the oldest one we have yet found, may have been one of the forces that helped invent civilization itself, not as a byproduct of civilization, as a precondition for it. The temple before the city, the gathering before the grain, the looking up at the stars and the carved animals on the pillars, before any of the rest of it. That is, in itself, a kind of answer to the question we've been carrying all night. What humanity forgets. We forget sometimes that the impulse toward meaning, toward building something together that has no obvious practical use, toward gathering in the cold on a hilltop to arrange heavy stones in careful circles for reasons that no one has yet been able to fully explain, that impulse is not a luxury that civilization eventually produces. It may be one of the oldest things about us. Older than cities, older than farming, older than writing, older than any of the scripts we cannot read. Göbekli Tepe was buried, deliberately, 12,000 years ago, and then forgotten for the rest of recorded history, until a shepherd and an archaeologist looked at an exposed limestone ridge in the 1990s and understood, slowly, what they were standing on. So let's gather everything, very softly, before the night takes it. 5 places, 5 silences. Ugarit, burning behind an unanswered letter, in a world so connected that when it fell almost everywhere at once. Mohenjo-daro, emptying slowly toward the east, into a silence with no villain and no fire, only a water table that kept falling. Cahokia, its great mound still rising over a plain that most people will never think to visit, its builder's story only recently beginning to be told at the scale it deserves. Great Zimbabwe, its walls still warm in the evening, its history never actually lost, only unheard, for a very long time, by people who weren't listening. And Göbekli Tepe, the oldest of them all, its deliberate circles of carved stone pointing towards something in our nature that was already ancient 12,000 years ago. The need to build something together, in the dark, that has no obvious use except that it means something. What do you do with all of that, at this hour, in the dark? I think you do what you've already been doing. You let it settle, without trying to hold all of it, without needing to remember every date and every city. You let what stayed with you stay, and you let the rest go quiet the way a story goes quiet when someone tells it slowly, in a room where the lights are low. Because here is the thing I keep coming back to, after all these evenings of sitting with these silences. None of these civilizations failed. That word is wrong for what they did. They rose, and they changed the world by rising, and they passed. And the world continued to be changed by the fact that they had been there, in the roads, in the crops, in the weights and measures, in the shapes of the cities that came after, in the memory that someone always kept, even when the wider world wasn't listening. You are the continuation of something unimaginably long. The warmth of a fire in a Bronze Age harbour, the weight of a seal in a merchant's palm, the careful, patient hand of someone setting a brick so precisely that it will still hold 4,000 years later in the ground. The child at the edge of the drain dropping pebbles, listening for the splash. None of them knew you were coming. All of them, in their way, made room for you. So let your breathing slow now. Let the images dissolve the harbour, the mound, the stone walls warm in the late light, the hilltop in the mountains where someone looked up 12,000 years ago and decided the sky deserved a monument. Let everything you heard tonight settle into the quiet layer of yourself where old things go when they've done their work. You are held by an enormous amount of human effort you will never see and never know. Rest well. Good night. Trail off silence.